Good morning, everybody. And first of all, I apologise for not being in the main room at the conference. I'm sorry that I missed that. So I'm just sort of trying to catch my breath back. First of all, Deborah Coles from Inquest was due to speak, but she's had to send her apologies because she's ill. So I'm just sending her apologies on behalf of the charity Inquest. Right, my brother is Sean Rigg, which I'm sure many of you will know about. This was my lovely, handsome brother. He died in August 2008. So I'm going to speak briefly about an update on my brother's case and the recent difficulties that we've had in terms of trying to get justice, and just to explain some of the legal loopholes and battles that every single family has to fight in order to even see a glimmer of justice. Now, the caption here is justice possible? It should be. There's everything in place for it to happen. But unfortunately, this judicial system, I believe, strongly puts obstacles in the way to make it almost impossible to actually get justice and to find out the truth of what actually happens to your loved one when they die in custody, in state custody. I sit with a family of friends called the United Families and Friends Campaign, which is a coalition of families who have lost loved ones in state custody. That includes police custody, psychiatric units, immigration, and prisons. And this is a list of some of the names that we know since 1969, I think this goes up to 2012, where there are 3,180 names of people that have died in state custody. And these are just the names that we know. This in itself shows the seriousness of this issue when people die in custody and they are controversial deaths. Not one single state agent has ever been made accountable for any of their wrongdoings and lack of duty of care, and in some cases unlawful killing. There has not been a conviction, and that's what families really want, is justice and accountability for any wrongdoing that any state agent has done, just as any ordinary member of the public would receive. But there are obstacles right from the very outset, within hours of your loved one's death. I believe the actions are put in motion to literally secure the evidence, literally. You can't send the criminal to the crime scene because evidently evidence will go missing. And unfortunately, and the truth is, there is a pattern. Since 1969, there's been so many deaths. I think what can easily be seen is that there is a general pattern in most of the controversial deaths where CCTV tends to go missing or it's not working. Officers' notebooks tends to go missing. Statements where officers are not interviewed immediately after a death, even though that person, their loved one, died in their hands, or immediately after contact of a police officer or so forth. The IPCC are supposed to be an independent body to act they shouldn't be biased, because they're an independent body that have been put there by the state. But what I found, and what other families has found, that we have not been able to depend on them, even though they are supposed to be independent. One of the main reasons being that it's literally crawling with ex-police officers within the IPCC. I think they retire to the IPCC. And well, I know in my brother's case, I can't speak for of every case, but I'm sure you'll probably hear it from other families, and you probably hear it from the Liberty here, is that ex-police officers were senior investigators in my brother's case within hours from the DPS and Scotland Yard were all in within hours of Sean's death. So I'm not really going to go over the whole issues of Sean's case, because I think some of you do know. I've been sending some cards round. I don't know where they are, and I hope everybody has got one in the room. So we do have a website, the Sean Rigg Justice and Change Campaign, and you can have a look at. There's lots of things online, but I will briefly, just very quickly, just say what the recent happenings on our case and how difficult it has been to really get justice at every single point. One of them being the retirement of police officers, where in most cases, particularly where there is an investigation against that officer, they always draw their ACE card, which is the get out of jail card, I believe. And they literally get away with it. They can retire and they can leave with their pensions. Usually this happens without the family's awareness, and it usually happens when the evidence is so compelling, and these are the words to this effect that the police gave themselves, that usually when they retire, when the evidence is so compelling, they're likely to be sacked or to be found guilty of misconduct. And in order to save costs from the public purse, they retire. This is an officer's quote. They retire in order to save costs. Well, really, I think they're just keeping their pensions, and they're allowed to move on to another force. And in my brother's case recently, PC Andrew Burks, who was one of the senior officers in Sean's case, attempted to retire to become a priest in the Church of England. Exactly. And it was absolutely bizarre, really, and it transpired that the Metropolitan Police and the IPCC were kind of aware of all of this happening. It was happening, since 2009, and Sean died in 2008, where he was attempting to become a priest. He did a theology degree and so forth. But his resignation was obstructed by the family when I found out, literally days before the expiry date, where his retirement would have been effective, and I was able to judicial review the Metropolitan Police, and he even went to the High Court, and it was reversed. And that's never happened before, and it has helped some other families since. So we really want to make a change so that officers cannot retire in order to avoid proceedings. And just very, very quickly, the recent case on Sergeant Paul White, who, where a file in our case went to the Crown Prosecution Service for perjury and perverting the course of justice, where the sergeant claimed that he went to the back of the van while Sean was there and gave a risk assessment, but the CCTV proved that he did no such thing. It's been 2 years since the IPCC were investigating that. It recently went to the Crown Prosecution Service, and lo and behold, they came back and said insufficient evidence, even though it was obvious that he didn't go to the van, and he didn't go to the van. But they are now saying there seems to be some medical evidence to support that he suffers from memory loss. So that's their reasoning by the CPS, and also where the other officer, PC Harrod, who had the same story basically, and we believe colluded, and they were speaking on social media, and the IPCC says, the CPS has said, whilst it was shown that they were speaking during the inquest, there's no evidence that they colluded, even though they gave the same evidence. So these are families, well, not some, that families, most of the time receive. So is justice possible? It should be, but they do everything to make it impossible.
Thank you, Marcia. But I just double-checked, but I looked a couple of weeks ago, but just this year, 18 people have died following contact with the police. And almost just over a year ago, Briggs died following contact with the police. And Louise is going to talk to us from the campaign.
I'm here to represent the family. It's been a year since Briggs was detained under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. An ambulance did turn up and was turned away by the police. Briggs was then cable-tied and put into a police van. Took approximately 10 minutes to get to Luton Police Station. About 8 minutes after he was put in the police cell, he died. And as I said, a year later, the IPCC are stumbling. There's delays within the inquest. The coroner's delaying things. One of the biggest delays, which I find absolutely outrageous, is they do not have the original ambulance report. Now, I would have thought that that piece of evidence from the start of the scene would be one of the most crucial. Why was the ambulance sent away? If it was a Section 136, if it was a mental health, the police had already detained him under that. So they'd already made that decision that there was a mental health problem. So then to continue, send the ambulance away, cable tie, a man with mental health conditions as well. You've got to remember people with supposed mental health conditions, if they're put in that situation, can you imagine how frightening it would have been as well? So yeah, we're a year down the line so far. We do have an update today. I was called at about 10 o'clock this morning. Bedfordshire Police Commissioner, Ollie Martins, has going to be releasing a press statement today to say that it is unacceptable and it is absolute disgrace that the IPCC are taking so long when they have just been given 29 million for investigative resources at a cost of £24,000 a month for the officers that are under suspension. There is 5 officers in this case that have been suspended. 5 of them are going forward for more interviews. Why they have to re-interview them again, I'm not too sure. In the beginning, they were allowed to confer before they gave interviews. I'm hoping that that policy's kind of been changed, so they need to make individual statements, perhaps. So the question being, is justice possible? The legal framework isn't supportive of civilians, I'm afraid, and that's the truth. It's not supportive of civilians. If you're going against a system that needs to protect itself, there is going to be every barrier and every obstacle put in for that. And as Marcia said, there hasn't been any convictions. Even when there is CCTV evidence of wrongdoing. We've got a case at the moment, Hilsborough in Birmingham. Apparently, they're going to be using the in-death custody syndrome. So they've actually made a syndrome for people dying in custody. And it's otherwise known as excited delirium, which isn't a medical condition recognised by the World Health Organization. Death in custody syndrome. Therefore, there's a syndrome that happens if you're in a cell, and that's what you die from. So nobody's had anything to do with it. It's nothing to do with restraint. Nothing to do with the police at all. It just happens. And I think this is going to be the next thing that comes up in a lot of cases, that they are going to, because the CCTV evidence is going to be apparent, I think the next thing they're going to use is a syndrome. And I ask everybody to keep their eye out in certain cases that this might actually be a verdict that comes out in a lot of them. So you have to watch their patterns. When Leon died, a few of us got together straight away. We didn't wait for verdicts, inquests or anything else. We'd seen other cases and we went straight in. We started with peaceful vigils, okay? No big action, nothing militant. We think that would have been playing into their hands of maybe later on tarnishing Leon's character. Well, look at these people. These are the people that he used to hang around with at school, etc. They're activists, they're rioters. It's because they do start smearing people's characters when they, as Marcia knows, and all the other families as well. They're always, unfortunately, it's the victim's fault. It's the victim's fault. The way they died is the victim's fault, which is, again, the death in custody syndrome that I was just talking about. So justice is possible. I believe in it, otherwise I wouldn't be here, otherwise I wouldn't be fighting, and otherwise I wouldn't be questioning every single thing that I actually perceive they're trying to do by the use of the media, by other verdicts. I keep an eye on things very tightly, and I'll be watching, and the other campaigns will be watching as well. So that's the latest. The police commissioner actually backing up the fact that the IPCC are an absolute disgrace at the moment. He's talking it from a monetary perspective, that the money could be going on other policing. The real cost is the human cost. At the end of the day, we can stand and fight, we can struggle as much as we like, but that's not going to bring that person back. It's not going to make it any easier on the children. Leon had 2 daughters. He's not going to see them marry, he's not going to see them have children, he's not going to be a grandfather, and I think that should be taken into account as much as what the police commissioner is talking about in terms of monetary loss. So watch this space. The next IPCC update, because they have to give the campaign an update in Luton Town Hall, is on the 20th of November. I shall have a list of questions for them. And they're always well prepared, put it that way. They're always very well prepared. I will be asking about the ambulance report in particular. A year, and there isn't. You know when an incident happens with an ambulance, there is a report created. It's not there. A year delay.
Paramedics do it immediately. They're around on the scene.
Yeah.
Paramedics. That was one of the first things we looked at.
Yeah.
It's very important.
Yeah, it's a vital, crucial piece of evidence, and for that not to be there, and they say, oh well, we want faith and confidence for our communities. Well, I'm sorry. If that was a civilian and that was a policeman involved, all of us would still be on remand. Probably they're doing 20, 25 years, something like that, or if we would have been let out at all. So is justice possible? Justice, I'm about to study a law degree, and I've been obviously looking into things. The theory of justice is everybody equal before the law. Well, if we're not, the point is we're not, because there's a big disparity between the communities, the society, the police system, and the government bodies that support them. Now, if that is a theory of justice, it's not correct, and I think the legal framework needs to be slightly dismantled in order for justice to be done. So that is another reform that us as a campaign will be asking. We've already kind of done one reform called Leon's Law, cross-party support in Luton Town Hall for police to wear body-worn cameras. We've asked for non-discretion, so they can't turn them on and off, because what is the point? There's absolutely no point if you're going to shield what you're doing. So from the point of an interaction with the public, they need to be on and kept on, particularly in arrest cases, and we understand the civil liberties arguments of what about maybe domestic violence issues, etc. We think the police should use, well, I can say that, but some kind of discretion in that particular thing. But if they are going to do stop and searches, they need to be filmed. If they are going to a section 136 in particular, it needs to be filmed from beginning. That evidence then needs to be streamed live to the police station and recorded. Any tampering of evidence should be should have severe penalties as well for the officers involved and anybody else. So that's where we stand. It doesn't happen now. But that's where we stand as a campaign, as well as getting justice for Leon. We also want to see reforms, accountability, and we're trying to put things in practice to ensure that happens. So we'll carry on going.
Now we're going to hear from Matt, who's going to talk about the Hilsborough campaign.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say, first of all, that it's a real privilege to talk alongside such kind of awe-inspiring campaigners, because I'm not really directly related with the Hilsborough Justice campaign. You know, I was a kid when it happened, not from Liverpool, but I have spent a long time looking at it and thinking about it and researching it. Also, got to be slightly careful because, of course, there's an inquest going on at the moment of Hilsborough, so it's not really going to be talking too much about the ins and outs of exactly what happened, but I'm sure everyone is kind of aware. The focus of my work on Hilsborough relates to the difference between looking at something and actually seeing it, which sounds a bit abstract, but I think it's actually directly relevant to Hilsborough and a lot of the other kind of deaths in custody and state-related violence deaths and stuff. Because if you think about, on the day itself at Hilsborough, a lot of the debate and controversy is about whether the police could actually see what was going on at the Leppings Lane end. And throughout the 90s, there were lots of legal challenges looking about whether CCTV cameras were working, whether films were stolen, what the police were doing on the day. Why couldn't they see something that was so obvious? And in a sense, I kind of think that the CCTV stuff, probably, who knows, they tamper with evidence all the time. It wouldn't surprise me if footage went missing, that wouldn't surprise me at all. But actually, I'm not sure that's the point, because in the Taylor inquiry in 1989, the police officers actually admitted that they had a clear view of Leppings Lane. They didn't need to look through the cameras, they could see with their own eyes. They could see Leppings Lane fine. And you've got to remember, they're police officers right in front of the perimeter fence, like as far away as I am from you. And you don't need a CCTV camera to see a 10-year-old boy being crushed to death in front of you. So they were looking, but they weren't seeing it. And I think that comes down to a question of recognition. Who has the right to be recognised by the state, by the police, by the media? And I think what a lot of these cases kind of demonstrate, that there's vast swathes of the population who the state don't deem worthy of recognition. They don't think they're worthy to recognise them for who they were, or what happened to them that actually happened. And they don't even recognise them even when they die. And they'll do anything to avoid recognising it, as the campaigners will know, right? They'll delay inquests, they won't have inquests at all, they'll fiddle around with the evidence before they present it to inquest. The IPCC will do, I mean, you always describe Mickey Mouse like investigations and stuff, right? And that's what they do. They don't want to recognise it. So for me, justice isn't like an end point, it's a struggle, it's a process. And it's a process which involves trying to force the state, force the media to recognise something that they are refusing to recognise. But it's a struggle, because they're struggling as well. It's a two-way thing. And when that does happen, when the state is forced to recognise what it's done, it's actually very dangerous. And if you look at the Hilsborough Independent Panel report, which came out in 2012, it's a really interesting example of that. So that report, famously said that 164 police statements had been altered before they presented to the Taylor inquiry. Now, that statement's in inverted commas because the officers were told not to make notes in their official police notebooks. They were told to make these kind of reminiscences, which would then be sent to the South Yorkshire Police legal team, who would kind of tidy them up before presenting them to the thing, apparently. This is what the Independent Panel report said. And 116 of those 164 statements had unfavourable comments removed concerning the police that day. Now, when that was announced in 2012 in Parliament, when Cameron announced it, it was all shock, horror, and there were gasps in Parliament and all this, right? It wasn't a shock for the families. It wasn't a shock for anyone who'd actually thought about Hilsborough for more than 10 minutes, right? It was confirmation of what everyone knew. And then the more I looked into this is really interesting, that actually, you know what, the state knew as well. The state knew as well. So if you could look back to 1989 and Lord Justice Taylor in his inquiry, he was informed that this process was going on about the alteration of statements. And he kind of, he actually wrote a very good report, to be fair. If everyone had listened to that report, none of this would have happened, because it basically, said what happened. But then in 1998, there was this Lord Justice Stuart Smith scrutiny of evidence that was set up by the new Labour government, and in which was trying to go over the evidence again and see if anything had been missed. In terms of reference, a bit weird, but anyway. And he was presented with evidence about this changing of statements, altering of statements, and he actually said in the report it was at worst an error of judgment, and even more unbelievably, he said it was actually understandable because the police were on the defensive. Right? So this is a judicial inquiry. You're like, whoa. And then another thing, in 1999, Phil Scraton, who is this professor who's really involved with the campaign from the beginning, like absolutely amazing guy, he wrote a book called Hilsborough the Truth, and he was also involved in the Hilsborough Independent Panel Report, and a lot of the stuff that was in the Independent Panel Report was actually in his book in 1999. Now he found more evidence which kind of backed up what he'd already said, but it was nothing like, it wasn't like this, it wasn't a surprise, it kind of proved what he'd already said. Now, so that means that the state kind of, it's not like it was brand new, they were kind of looking at the evidence, but they were refusing to see it, they were refusing to recognise it for what it was. And the campaign, that struggle, long struggle to bring it and force it to recognise, and that's what happened in 2012. Now the problem is that when you do that, when you bring this kind of memory, this memory of oppression, the memory of what people are really like, and you bring it into the present, it's actually quite dangerous for the state. So they'll do anything to try and stop that happening. And so, because it's a struggle, as I say, the process, getting justice is a struggle, and they're struggling as much as the campaigners are. And they have different tactics. So the classic tactic is, either just direct oppression, or it's kind of silence, they won't say anything, neither confirm nor deny, or they'll delay, or officers will resign or retire and all this kind of stuff. They'll do anything to try and not do it. But when they're forced to recognise it, they kind of have to go down a different tactic, which is what happened with Hilsborough. Sorry, and that's what they try and sanitise it. They try and clean it up, and they try and kind of bring it back into their own narrative. So that's what happened with Hilsborough. So after the 2012 report, you have Jack Straw. Now, Jack Straw was the Labour Home Secretary in 1998 at the time of the Stuart Smith scrutiny. So he would have seen the same evidence as Stuart Smith, or if he didn't see it, he wasn't doing his job properly. Which means he must have known something about the supposedly altered statements. Anyway, but nothing to see here. And then I think Blair wrote on a memo at the time when the Stuart Smith scrutiny was going on. He wrote, "Why bother? Why are we bothering?" With Hillsborough. Anyway, in 2012, Jack Straw then comes out after the report with all these statements saying, "Oh yes, Thatcher's police. There was a culture of impunity. It was political policing. Oh, it was all linked with a minor strike. Oh, the bad old days of the 80s. Oh, Thatcher, how terrible." Right? Well, yeah, all of that's true. But the issue is, it's not the bad old days. By putting it, just saying, "Oh, it's the bad old days. It doesn't happen now. It couldn't happen now. It's impossible." That kind of cleans it up. It kind of makes it this kind of weird negative nostalgia for the black and white 80s and terrible, how grateful we are we've got past that. Well, that's trying to make it safe. That's trying to make that memory safe, because the danger is if you bring it into the present, suddenly you start seeing all these connections between what happened in 1989 and what's happening now. So 2012, the independent panel report comes out, and that's all saying the stuff about these connections between the police and the media, the police kind of, in the media, police feeding the media all these lies about the Hillsborough victims and everything. Well, that's exactly what happened the year before when they had the Murdoch thing and the News of the World hacking thing, and that showed all these weird links between the police, and they were paying police for stories. And then you think, well, okay, in 2011 you had the riots in London after the shooting of Bolton. And that was kind of related to a long history of stop and search and racist policing. Well, then that links up with the 1981 riots in Brixton and in Toxteth in Liverpool, right? Which is to do with the sus laws and stop and search. And stop and search as a policy was developed with football fans as guinea pigs, as well as the black community. Football fans, there's a link there. And then you think Toxteth, okay, Liverpool. Well, Liverpool was a centre of resistance to Thatcherism, and actually Liverpool's kind of resistance to Thatcherism kind of played into this kind of mythology of the whinging Scouser. "Oh, let's get over it. Why won't you accept neoliberalism? Blah, blah, blah. Stop moaning." Well, that kind of stereotype then feeds into the media stereotyping of Hillsborough. "Oh, let's get over it. Come on. Just why are you always moaning all the time?" That kind of stuff. And then you had spying on justice campaigns. That evidence came out around the same time as the Hillsborough stuff. And the Hillsborough campaign themselves, they've always said that they felt they were being spied on. So all these kind of connections start being made. And by trying to put it in the past, that's trying to stop you making those connections. And it's not like Hillsborough will happen again as Hillsborough, because it won't. Like, football's different, it's a different thing. But the point is, it happens in the same processes and the same forces kind of produce new events, which are basically like Hillsborough. Like, if you think about the numbers of people who've died in custody, 3,000 or whatever, and you know, like you said, 18 this year, that's like a slow motion Hillsborough. Over, you know, 96 died in one event, but then you have a death, a death, a death, a death, a death. And what happens is, then the media, they'll demonise different people. So it'll be the people that the media demonise. So if you think about, I don't know, the thousands of migrants dying in the Mediterranean at the moment, migrants, they're evil, you know, it's their own fault, or it's going to lead them to drown. Well, that's the Hillsborough as well. And so they always want to try and make, it's in the past, but it's not, it's in the present. And I think the key point for me about justice is that you can't understand the present without understanding the past, and you can't understand the past without understanding the present. And it's the struggle to try and do those things, which I think is where justice begins. Because it's not, like I said, it's not an end point, it's a process, it's a struggle, but that's at least where I think it begins.
Thank you, Matt.
One.